Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are continuing our online edition of the course on the history of British art, and today it's time to talk about Scotland and the art of Scotland. Um, this is a big subject, and if you're interested, there are episodes in the documentary series about Scotland, and there are separate documentaries only dealing with Scottish art. I'll give you some links in the mail, but those of you who watched A Picture of Britain, there is a Scottish episode. Also the accompanying series about the architecture, how we built Britain, has a Scottish episode, and there is a 4-episode BBC documentary, The Story of Scottish Art. I couldn't find the first episode. If you find it online, please send me a link, but the remaining 3 are there, and they're very interesting to watch. And generally, of course, there is a Moodle presentation with some illustrations for today's class. So please open the Moodle presentation and see it as well. Generally, when we talk about Scotland from the perspective of the history of art, it's basically the balance or the conflict sometimes between 2 approaches and 2 sides to Scottish culture and Scottish art. One is the nostalgic side, the one with the mountains and the castles and the clans, the tartans and the Highland dress. That is why in the first illustration you have a man wearing a traditional Highland dress. We'll talk about it in a little moment. So the nostalgic view of Scotland as the wild and proud and ancient land within Great Britain. And the other side of the Scottish culture, something especially visible towards the end of the 19th century and then in the 20th century, is Scotland as the modern part of Britain. Scotland as the place with experimental artists, artists who looked beyond the British Isles, who would travel quite a lot to Europe and paint there and be inspired by European trends, sometimes the trends that were not very popular in other areas of Great Britain. So in the first few slides you have some elements of architecture. So mostly the castles, some of the old historical castles with a lot of cultural and historical significance, such as of course Edinburgh Castle and Stirling Castle, the royal castles of Scotland. You have to remember that until the Stuart dynasty came to the throne, the Scottish Stuart dynasty, England and Scotland were 2 separate kingdoms with centuries of separate history, of separate culture, sometimes even of warfare, if you think about that. And this is visible in the landscape. This is visible in the architecture of Scotland, and especially in the particularly Scottish. And here is the cat assistant coming. Particularly Scottish type of castles, the castles that come from the 16th century, from the 17th century, and which are mostly described with the words the Scottish baronial style. The Scottish baronial style is like this castle in Aberdeenshire that you have in the illustration. There was a little bit of electricity between me and the cat. And if you compare them with English castles, especially the medieval English castles, they were more inspired by the continental traditions. They look like castles in France or in Germany. This is something that has been noted about Scotland, that their castles have turrets, they are more irregular, they are in fact more picturesque than the English castles, whose function was mostly military. If you look at slightly later period, the 18th century, the 19th century, many of these castles were rebuilt or expanded, sometimes in modern continental styles, like Kinross House you have here from the late 17th century, which is more like a classicist palace. Sometimes in the nostalgic way, as you will see in probably the most important 19th century realization, that is Balmoral Castle, bought by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, and expanded, rebuilt for them in the most Scottish style imaginable. Uh, Apart from the castles and the palaces, there are of course quite a lot of picturesque fishing villages like Crowley here in Aberdeenshire, little towns, and other interesting places, the ruined abbeys, especially in the south of Scotland, and in the north, in the Scottish Isles, especially the Orkneys. You have culture going as far back as generally culture in the British Isles, because you have prehistoric monuments from the Neolithic period. If you remember our very first class, and Skara Brae, the Neolithic village, it's in Scotland, it's in the Scottish Isles, in the Orkneys. So it's really a very long story, and if you're interested, I strongly recommend that you see this 4-part Scottish documentary. After the unification of Scotland and England, the culture becomes more and more integrated. So in the 18th century, in the 19th century, you have English and other foreign artists, French and American, going to Scotland, being inspired by Scotland. Some of them are even reaching the status of being more Scottish than the Scots themselves. You'll see in a little moment. You have all the trends that are popular in the British art in the 18th century and in the 19th century, especially the importance of portraiture. You have some important local artists, of whom probably the most famous and the most successful would be Henry Raeburn. You have portraits of local celebrities, like here you have by Alexander Naismith the portrait of Robert Burns, the national poet of Scotland, and by Raeburn the portrait of Sir Walter Scott, so another great literary mind of Scotland, a man largely responsible for the early 19th century romance of Scotland through his novels, through his historical novels. So if we look at the late 18th century and early 19th century, there is a lot of landscape painting in Scotland, very much in the tradition of the Romantic landscape. So everything that you remember about the Romantic landscape, with the craggy mountains, with the lakes, with the ruins, with the dramatic lighting conditions, with sometimes even little human figures shown for scale, basically, or cows and other animals to add to the picturesque and the sublime values of the Scottish landscape. You have a lot of that. Some of those places, like especially Loch Katrine, were inspired by literature, mostly by Walter Scott's novels. And here you have one example of a landscape with tourists at Loch Katrine. Loch Katrine was one of the places described by Sir Walter Scott, and his novels were so popular that people would actually travel from all over Britain to see those places, and you'll have quite a lot of tourism in a similar vein that you would have people coming to the Lake District or to Wales. So what develops is the romance of the outdoors in Scotland, popularized by Alexander Naismith and George Fennell Robson and John Knox and Horatio McCulloch and other artists who specialized in the romanticized visions of the Scottish landscape, with the glens and the lochs and the bends, so the mountains and the lakes and the valleys. Sometimes, like one of the landscapes by McCulloch, they would even add extra romantic touches in the titles, like he calls one of his works with the title of a popular folk song, "My Heart is in the Highlands." So this is the country of the romantic novels of Sir Walter Scott. This is the country of the clans and the tartans and the proud people who would never yield unless they did, really, to the British. And this romance really continues well into the 19th century. That is why I include here Wallace Monument in Stirling, just opposite the old royal castle, the old Scottish royal castle in Stirling. In the middle of the 19th century, there is a massive neo-Gothic tower who is built solely as a monument commemorating a great national hero, William Wallace. You may remember the film Braveheart. That's the man, the leader of the fighting for Scottish freedom against the English invasions in the Middle Ages, so the invasions of Edward I and Edward II. So that's one side of that, and the culmination of the Scottish romance is really in 1822, when King George the Fourth, the last of the four Georges from the Hanoverian dynasty, the fourth king in this dynasty, not a very popular man, and if you look at his portraits, a man who was quite far from a beauty ideal of the age, being overweight and rather stocky and ridiculed for his looks. However, he was quite a lover of literature. He loved the novels of Jane Austen, and he loved the novels of Walter Scott. And he decided to visit this part of his kingdom and to visit Edinburgh and other places in Scotland on an official royal visit. And he even asked Sir Walter Scott himself to organize this visit for him, so to make sure that everything would be as Scottish as possible. He was accompanied by the royal portrait artist, the official artist of the royal court, David Wilkie, who would basically document the whole royal visit. And you can see the entrance of George IV at Holyrood House, so the palace in Edinburgh, built on the opposite side of the Royal Mile from the royal castle, but much more comfortable and livable. And the entrance of George IV was really celebrated as the visit of um, the super clan leader, like the chief of the Scottish chiefs. So George IV was himself dressed up in Highland dress, in tartan and kilt and sporran and all the elements of the Scottish dress. You can see the illustration also by David Wilkie of George IV in a Highland dress, looking as good as David Wilkie could paint him while still being realistic. And this was a great success because this was, for the first time, like forever, a royal visit from the King of Great Britain, who was not coming as the leader of the invasion army. And you have to remember that after the Hanoverians took the throne, there was quite a lot of resistance in Scotland. There was basically an insurrection called Jacobite Rebellion, orchestrated with the help of France, actually, by the branch of the Stuarts who were excluded from the throne because they were Catholics, but they were of course the old Scottish dynasty and they had quite a lot of following, which ended in a bloody insurrection crushed mercilessly by the Hanoverians, actually by George the fourth predecessor, George II, during the Battle of Culloden in the middle of the 18th century. And after that, for quite a while, any display of Scottish nationalism, including Scottish dress and Scottish clan culture, were against the law. This changes with the royal visit of George IV, and this is the legitimization of all those portraits. You have two examples, one by John Singleton Copley, an American artist who moved to Britain and who worked there, and another by Henry Raeburn himself, of the Scottish aristocrats dressed up in tartans and kilts. This had to be hidden, this had to be clandestine because of the ban on any signs of Scottish regional patriotism. This only changes after George IV's visit to Scotland. We continue.